thank you to all our presenters for really engaging and fascinating morning and early afternoon's worth of talks. So are there questions from whoever's still here, actually? Thinned out a little bit, I guess, is a nice Friday afternoon. Yeah, Jeffrey.
Yeah, this is a question for anybody, really. I enjoyed all the papers, and I was trying to look for connecting themes and things, and I found a quote that was on the screen from one of the plastic artists, and the quote runs, "Color is a seducer of our visual sense." And I think some of the papers, to me anyway, kind of suggested that somehow, someone used the word that, let's see if I can find it here, that form has to do with beauty and spirituality, and color has to do with materiality. So I just wonder if you could talk about, any of you, about the ways in which there's something disreputable about color, and that somehow a colorless world is more pure and beautiful. Is that an appropriate question?
We can talk about it. Maybe we can share. Well, I was thinking specifically about David Batchelor's argument about chromophobia when I was mentioning the artists that were working in sort of achromatic plastic works. And in Batchelor's argument, he does talk about how, we see, color as, or sort of culture sees color as, it's kind of the sort of adulterating of things, and that there is purity in sort of the white space, and that by inserting color into an environment, it invites in like lust or sin or playfulness of youth or immaturity, or anything really on the spectrum other than like what you say is the sort of purity of white. And also I think in terms of the work that I was looking at, I think Batchelor also talks about the sort of elitism in art, with the white room, which you're talking about, the white cube, yeah, and so the idea of making art that is of this sort of rainbow of colors, really kind of went against these sort of ideas of sort of purism of white and elitism of white. So I don't know if either one of you want to talk about that.
There is a quote by Goethe that says that gray is the color of theory, and green is the golden tree of life. And I don't know if that means anything to you, but in architecture, color is actually a material. It's not a construction material, but it is a material that is thought of as immaterial because of its use of masking the material beneath it. So it is mostly associated with artistic expression instead of expressing ideals, mainly because we use words for ideas and images for art, I suppose, mostly. And that's all I could say.
Hi, I have a question about the space talk, and I think what you're saying is really interesting about how this space interest is coming again, and there's actually an architecture firm, I thought about architecture when you said something, called Clouds Architecture Office, and they have this concept where they are building these like launching rockets that attach to comets and then like 3D build colonies on the comet, and it's really amazing. You should check it out. But I was also just wondering, personally, because you took the topic up, what's your how do you feel about the going into space, and what's your personal opinion and interest in it?
I actually have a little less of an opinion on that than you might expect. I was raised in a family that was really into planetary independence, but I'm really much more interested in it as like what is going on, what's the anthropological,
So you don't want to go to space?
I certainly don't want to go to space. I think I would support colonies on Mars. Like I'm okay with my tax dollars being used to pay for that.
Okay. Good to know.
In regards to plastics, oh, sure. In regards to plastics, there was no talk about toxicity, and I wondered if there was any of that in your studies.
Sure, absolutely. Well, in 1974, I think, is when OSHA was founded, and that was, following findings of factory workers and vinyl factories getting higher rates of cancer. And then, of course, I did leave it out, but the exhibition Trio happened shortly after Eva Hesse passed away, and it was sort of a posthumous, it wasn't necessarily a memorial of her because there's no mention of it in the exhibition catalog that she had died. But of course, in the conversation around her work, there's speculation that her use of these industrial materials led to her, getting cancer. And then certainly one of the sort of implications in my conclusion about future damages that the plastics industry suffered, that toxicity was one of the big blows to the public image of plastic, and art did little to help that. And I think actually artists stopped calling attention to the fact that they were working in plastic. And many schools, I've heard, I am not a practicing artist, but I've spoken to friends of mine, colleagues who are in the MFA programs, have said that schools no longer teach resins because of the toxicity, certain schools. And actually a friend of mine knew a professor at Cooper Union who was a professor of teaching resins and who passed away. Do you know? Or?
No, I wanted you to say something
Oh.
and add another aspect to that.
Well, that's only to say that, yeah, toxicity has come into my research. It's a little bit, the work that the era that I'm looking at is a little bit earlier than some of the toxicity, and I kind of use OSHA and actually Earth Day as the sort of breaking point for when this art in plastic boom ended. So, yeah.
Well, there's also in addition to the toxic nature of plastic, there is the question of the longevity of it. And for example, at the Brooklyn Museum, we have the famous Olivetti portable typewriter from
What are you talking about? Yeah.
the 50s, and I, in fact, gave my Olivetti portable typewriter that I bought in the 60s to the museum. So I gave it in the 80s, and it was reasonably stable. But we've noticed in the last 10 years that the plastic dust cover on the typewriter is melting. Mm-hmm. And much to everyone's horror at the museum, and then our conservators commented that all the plastic objects in the museum are melting. So it's just an observation and yet another thing that plastic has to overcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of my research has been, because I'm working on this exhibition at the Neuberger Museum, and so I'm working with a number of at least 30 objects that are made of plastic. And we've certainly come across conservation issues with the exhibition, and I've been working with Christine Frohnert and Reinhard Beck, who are conservators of contemporary art. I've been in conversation with them around these issues of plastic conservation, and it's not something that artists really had in mind when they were making this work, because a lot of the marketing around plastic was that it was this durable, permanent thing, and nobody knew how it would decay. And now we're seeing that it does crack, it does discolor, and and the way that you would kind of go about restoring it is not how you would restore something else, so they have to develop new conservation methods for each kind of chemical compound of plastic that was developed in the 60s. So.
Just one more thing. I just attended a show with the Jacob Javits Center on 3D printing. And that's a big thing with CADs and making in plastics and resins, or so I don't know if that's less toxic today or it's a thought behind it.
Well, Elizabeth and I actually talked about this, about how the sort of irony of 3D printing is that it's like part of the it's like maker movement and the DIY movement, and you know, supposedly, you know, somewhere down in the argument for 3D printing is that there's like less waste or something, but it actually is still plastic. It's still a material. It's still putting objects into the world that are not going to decay in landfill, are not going to, you know, recede into the earth. And you know, I think that's it. I think in 3D printing we're seeing sort of a resurgence of what was happening in the 60s, of what I was talking about. We're really excited about it, but we don't really know what the future of it is, and it could be potentially just as damaging, you know, for us to be just making lots of random stuff, like little trinkets that don't have any purpose. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. My question is particularly for Abir. I was wondering, in New York, of course, there's the new Whitney Museum, which is set to open, I think, next week. But in the New York Times last weekend, the architectural review was really about the new Whitney Museum and its role as a community building place. And also, it was a very ambivalent review of the museum as a white cube. And it, I thought, startlingly, was very laudatory towards the old Whitney Museum, the Breuer building, which is really this mass of concrete surrounded by a forbidding moat. And I was wondering what your thoughts were on either the new Whitney or just an emergence of the White Cube Museum generally.
Well, generally, when I started writing this paper, what caught my attention is there a rule of using colors in museums? Should there be rules, whether we should use lots of colors or no color at all? And so when I was searching, I couldn't find any reference to that other than the main or the most important person who decide on that is the curatorial committee. And what do they think about, and what are they trying to convey? What are their story? What's the purpose of the collection and what they're trying to say, the message? And so for me, just using the white cube idea, I know it could be really harsh that I'm going against like a big critic like O'Doherty, but I just believe that it creates a multiple of the same thing. You know, like at the end, it's just a shell, and then you have the artwork inside. But I believe that there need to be more to add a character and to end up with something very different.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is a question for Claire and Maylene, and I'm wondering, just building on this issue of the stability of the materials, how these colors, we saw how the natural colors, Claire, in your talk change over time. Those purples turn to brown. But it seems that the synthetic dyes that were used continue to be vibrant and they're lasting. So I'm wondering, is this something we can continue to anticipate, the stability of these synthetic colors, or in the next 100 years, are these going to change as well? And Maylene, is there any consideration thinking about how these colors in the digital printing will last or transform?
Yeah. For my part, I haven't done a lot of research into the conservation concerns around synthetic dyes, so I can't really answer your question that well. But one of the major reasons that the synthetic dyes were so popular when they first came out was the fact that they were color fast, especially some of the natural dyes that were used in Japan. One that was called benibana, which was used to make red, was incredibly expensive and very fugitive. So it was actually kind of a metaphor in the culture of that day, in poetry and that kind of thing, that red is fleeting, it's symbolic of that. And having these synthetic dyes that had these greater color fast properties was really revolutionary and popular.
But that's not quite true, because these aniline dyes are now known to be, not all of them, but some of them, you pointed out the purple in particular, incredibly fugitive, and that those purples from the late 19th century are indeed now all brown or beige. And there's further some evidence that these aniline dyes have their own built-in enemies, and that they actually attack the fibers. And so they, not only the color's not fast, but they're actually disintegrating the very fibers they were meant to
Right.
decorate. So, I mean, it's, we need new dyes that don't do that.
Right, yeah. And I think that's a good example of, like we were talking about with the plastics, at the time that this becomes popular, no one's thinking about that. You know, you aren't thinking about your clothing as something that is going to be in a museum 100 years later. You're like, oh, I just want that new color, and yeah.
But is Sorensen thinking about this?
Not necessarily. I think the initial focus in selecting the yarns for the work is to make sure that, I mean, particularly in her work, that you have sufficient quantities that are all consistent in color, which means probably chemical dye processes as opposed to natural dyes, which are far more variable. But with the quantity of thread that goes into a single tapestry and the way she, has constructed them, the consistency is probably her more immediate focus. And the other issue is, with a lot of these, we just don't really know, what's going to happen 50, 100 years from now.
This is a question for Phoebus. You showed an image of the interior of the Crystal Palace for the 1851 exhibition with the colored textiles, the red, blue, and yellow textiles that my understanding was Owen Jones actually did that interior decoration. So I have a very specific, what was the relationship between Owen Jones and Semper? Is he being influenced by Semper's ideas? And it's also that idea of which you raised, the textiles as walls. So anyway.
Yeah, it was a great mystery for me why Semper made this metaphor with the color as coating and dressing. And then I found out that his parents actually had an industry of textiles. So that solves the question. And next thing is that when he left for London, he went to he wrote to Owen Jones for work, because he had a lot of work because of his organization of the Great Exhibition. And they also had a common friend named Guri, who accompanied Semper also in Athens in his trip to Greece, and also a couple of years later he continued his journey to Alhambra with Owen Jones. So they had a common friend. And Semper wrote to him, and they also had a very interesting. They worked together in the structuring of museums about industry, and also an institution, because Owen Jones wanted to make, he's a predecessor of the arts and crafts movement, and he needed the architect Semper, because he had great knowledge of history, and he had also this view that structure has great effect in form, in architectural form, and together they worked for the organization of institution of the former arts and crafts movement.
Thank you.
I think that was great. Thank you so much to our participants. Thank you to you who are still here on a Friday afternoon. We will obviously, this symposium will spark a number of conversations and thoughts, and I'm already rethinking my own research into 3D printing and other kind of technologies of production based on some of the things that we've done here today. But I think it is now time for lunch. We've all done this on an empty stomach since the coffee break. So again, just my greatest thanks to our participants, to Dr. Meikle for his wonderful keynote address, and thank you for attending this symposium.